Scaling to 3 billion requests per day with James Avery.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your humble host, and make sure to check out www.azuredevops.show for past episodes and show notes. And few announcements. The book, .NET DevOps for Azure, is available. You can get it at bit.ly/.NET DevOps book. That's DOTNET DevOps book, and the ebook at bit.ly/.NET DevOps ebook. And there's also a special offer. Anyone running a conference or a local user group or anyone speaking at those, for those in-person events, I'd love to send 2 copies of the book for you to give away to attendees. And so to request those, you can go to bit.ly/.NET DevOps book for community. And we're getting that going with the publishing companies. We can distribute it on Amazon or whatnot, but we're getting it right from the book manufacturer for the preview edition because it was just launched at Build. The manuscript was complete, hot off the presses, and gotten a tremendous interest. So we're excited to get that out there. And I'm working on the .NET Core 3 edition to put out somewhere at the end of the year. So lots of work to do. But let's get on with the show. I'm really excited to have James Avery with me. He's the founder and CEO of Adzerk. And James, how are you, sir? Welcome to the show.
Doing great. Happy to be here, Jeffrey.
Absolutely. We've known each other for, that's 13, 14 years or 15?
At least, yeah.
I forgot.
I think it started like 2008-ish, so maybe a little bit earlier than that, but yeah.
Yeah. And you've done quite a few really, really interesting things, and of course our audience here is for people shipping software with Microsoft technologies, and you've done a lot of that. But for people who might not be familiar with your story, I'll let you tell it firsthand. How did you end up deciding to start Adzerk, and what was your path towards that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like when we knew each other, I was a software engineer doing consulting. We're Microsoft MVPs running into each other at conferences and on the speaking circuit and things like that. And then I kind of went down the path of, I did consulting for a while, started down the path of wanting to build a product. Actually ended up starting a couple of products. So I started one, which was some ad networks. So some people probably remember the Lounge, which was kind of this collection of influential .NET people like Phil Hack, Scott Hanselman. I believe you were part of it at one point. Yes, awesome.
Yep.
Trying to remember, it's been a while. Also started a little company called TechPub with a guy named Rob Connery, where we were doing kind of videos, kind of the same time Pluralsight was getting started. Obviously, Pluralsight was a little more successful than we were, but we actually ended up selling that company to Pluralsight. But my focus at that time had really switched to Adzerk. So coming from the ad networks, I decided to really move away from the ad networks, sold those to a company up in Canada, and decided to focus on Adzerk, the software as a service platform. And back then, the vision was I wanted to help other people start ad networks like mine. So this is, from the beginning, it's a software as a service platform to help companies build ad networks. That did not work at all. So we tried that for a while, did not work. Then it started to shift to say, well, there's opportunities with lots of sites, right? Like all sites need to serve ads. And we're very focused on kind of just serving traditional ads. And this is around circa like 2010. And I got lucky that I'd kind of been pestering Jeff Atwood for a long time to join my network. And this is coding horror. Everybody here I'm sure knows him. And he was like, hey, in Stack Overflow, we need an ad server. Do you think you could do it? And I'm like, sure. I didn't know if we could handle the scale of, Stack Overflow. Even in 2010, it had pretty impressive scale.
Oh, yeah.
So I started talking to them, flew up, met with Joel Spolsky, which was amazing. When you grow up reading all of his stuff and to be like sitting in a room trying to pitch him, it was pretty intense. And then and then they came back and said, well, you're missing these 15 things. Like we'd have to have these 15 things to be able to use you. And this is where being a software developer was useful, right? Because I was like, okay. So I told my wife, and like my daughter had just been born. I'm like, I'm going to be, busy for 6 weeks. Like, obviously
Right.
wasn't shirking my dad duties, but I was like, I'm going to be heads down, just cranking out code to see if I can meet, the goals and the things that they needed to go live.
Development in diapers.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I remember my daughter and her little swingy thing next to my computer as I just sit there and hammer on the keyboard trying to get this stuff going. And this is all in ASP.NET back then, all kind of MVC. And the original version, as we talk about the title, like we're now serving 3 billion a day. Back then it was like 5,000 a day or something like that, right? Like we're talking about a very small amount. I'm like sure, blogs are popular, but they're not that popular, maybe 100,000 a day or something like that, like a pretty small number. And I was a enterprise.NET developer. I was building stuff for insurance companies where we had, you're like, how do we handle 50 users? Like where everything is, you get a list of stuff back from SQL Server, update the item, save it back to SQL Server. This is not, it's all hard, but it's very different when you have to try to shift to, these big scalability projects.
Right.
Problems become the scale, whereas I think in the other ones, the problems become dealing with the business, understanding what the business needs, making sure you're solving their problem. So back then when we first got started, this was getting ready to go live with Stack Overflow. So I kind of crunched through all those things, got their approval, we're getting ready to go live. It was all pretty naively built. It was all just one monolithic app, all just a big ASP.NET app, SQL Server. We would hit SQL Server, on every call, and say, ad serving is essentially a bunch of different business logic. So you're making a lot of decisions on which ad should be served based on budgets and targeting and things like that. And so we just make live calls to SQL. Sure, why not? Should work.
Right.
And it works to some extent. And then we had to try to figure out how to go live with Stack Overflow. So I remember the night, I still remember, it's like ingrained in my memory in like 2010 when I'm on Skype chat with like Jeff Atwood and a couple other guys from Stack. And they're like, okay, we're going to turn you on. And I'm like, okay, cool. And I'd actually just moved to Amazon. So we had just gotten live on AWS. This is, a long time ago. So there was no other options. I think it was like maybe SoftLayer or Rackspace or one of those ones that were too expensive for me.
Right.
So I put it up on AWS and I knew I was worried there might be a problem. So it used to be they were all on just one server, right? Like ad server, UI, and database were just like on one server on AWS. So that, okay, I should split the web server out, the ad server out at least. So if I need to scale it, I can hopefully spin some extra ones up. They hit it, the whole thing just immediately goes down. And they're like, hey, what's going on? And I'm like, I won't cuss on your podcast, but there's lots of cussing, trying to, like, oh, what happened? Like, I'm blowing my moment, right? This is the chance to like get Stack Overflow live.
Right.
And it all just crashed, just went down. But thankfully I'd done the work to make sure it could run on that separate box. And so I quickly like created an ELB, Elastic Load Balancer, spun up like 3 of these machines. They were all, easy to get set up. I don't think I had any automated tooling. This is me just, manually spinning things up and logging into machines to like FTP things up, or, it was very skunk works. It's just me. But then I get 3 servers up, and 3 was enough to serve their traffic.
Ah.
So then we get live. And so we're live. SQL Server's running a little bit hot. Like, I'm like, okay, I can upgrade that tomorrow.
Yep.
But it was up and running. And so it was a little bit of a bad look to when they first hit it for it to totally go down. But that was really kind of the first time that I saw that, hey, the cloud changes everything, right? Like if I had to try to call somebody to re-rack servers, like that business is probably gone. And like Adzerk's probably not around today. So, right. I don't think anybody needs to be sold on the cloud anymore, but it's kind of a tangible story of it saving my butt.
Yes. I can see that.
And then yeah. So like once we had Stack, that helped us start to get a lot more exposure. Because obviously everybody knows Stack Overflow. We got a lot of leads and things like that from it.
Right.
And so we also had to start re-architecting our software, trying to figure out like how do we actually run this, at scale. So first thing we did was just start doing some naive like caching, right? Just saying, okay, like if an ad call looks the same as the one you got a second ago, why hit the database again for it? Right. So we'll just say, and they don't have to be, ad calling is kind of fuzzy. It doesn't have to be 100% correct, right? It has to be 99%. So you can cache the results for a couple minutes. So we started with that, and that bought us a bunch of headroom, right? Because you're just saying, okay, we'll cache this, hit the database when we don't have it in cache.
Now, are you literally talking about output caching with the controller action attribute or some other type of?
No, it was actually, so it's the way to think about ad serving is that you go look at like a candidate list. So like you go to Stack Overflow, it goes to load the ads up. It's going to go and pull available ads that it might show you, right? And it's going to pull that available list of ads, and then it's going to do filtering to say, oh, you're in Texas, so this one's targeted to Seattle. I'm not going to show you that ad. Or, oh, this ad is targeted to people on the C# tag and you're on the Azure tag. And so things like that. And then filter that list down, figure out what the best one to serve to you is, and then serve you that ad. So what we actually started caching was we were caching that candidate list. So instead of going back and saying, okay, the candidate list for, it's this site, we know it's the Stack Overflow site, whatever zone it is, ad type, things like that, we can cache that candidate list of, let's say 20 ads. It can be a lot more than that. But back then it was usually pretty small. It was like 20 ads, and then it would filter it down. And so we're just preventing that initial hit to the database, and which obviously improved performance a lot.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. And how long did those 3 servers last you until you had the next bottleneck?
Yeah, it was. Well, I remember those two, like back in the day, they were like M3 mediums. So they were like really small instance types on Amazon. The good thing was that we could basically, once we added the caching, that kind of relieved some of the pressure on SQL Server. And we just started kind of scaling the servers out as we needed them. But then quickly,
this is still all you, right?
At that time, it's still all me. So this is kind of the end. This is the end of 2010. And I have a software engineering background. I'd done consulting, but I'd never run a company like this at all. So I'm kind of learning all that as I go along too. The beginning of 2011, we hired our first second engineer, but we didn't have a lot of money. So there's a guy who I love. He did a lot of great work, but he's also right out of college, right? Like I can go afford to hire, a great architect who built lots of stuff. It was like, okay, we need more hands on keyboards to try to help build this stuff.
Right.
And so did that. And then we thought, okay, well, we've got Stack Overflow. There's tons of other sites out there. Like we've got to be onto something. So we went and raised money, raised $650,000 in kind of seed financing. And then what we realized is that what everybody else a lot of other people probably knew, we didn't know, is that Stack Overflow is very unique. They're a very unique site. They have very unique requirements. They're very particular people in Jeff and Joel. And nobody else cared about what they cared about. So we had essentially built a perfect product for just the few things they cared about that didn't apply to most other publishers. So then we got to go through the hard time of figuring out what is our market actually. And it took us a couple years to figure that out. We kind of tried different things. We tried making the product free and saying like anybody can sign up and use it. That didn't work. We tried targeting more sophisticated ad networks. Those guys were all kind of going out of business until we kind of stumbled upon the fact that because we're developers and we've always been a very developer-centric company, we built a ton of APIs. And so we had like good APIs to talk to our systems. We had good APIs to get ad calls. And we realized that like really the companies that we're signing up were ones that were like, oh, you guys have a good API and you actually have developers that'll help us like figure out how to do this. Yeah. We're not stuck in like a support queue talking to somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. So that's really where, that was probably like not till 2013, 14 that like we figured that out. And then we've started to scale, and now our focus is really on API-based ad serving. So we actually don't even work with Stack Overflow anymore because they need this, web-based, banner ads. And we've gone this really other direction and saying that our focus is API. letting people build really unique ad formats, like what you see on like Facebook or Instagram, places like that, like those kinds of ad formats, but you want to bring that to your own product.
Okay.
And so I kind of skipped ahead. We'll go back to the scalability because I figured that the business story is better to tell kind of as one piece.
Right.
But yeah, like if you go to like Ticketmaster, you'll see banner ads, which are served by Google, the king of banner ads. But you'll also see shows, like promoted shows. So like let's say you went to see Metallica, and they're like, hey, like also Megadeth is coming to town. You might want to go see them, and that's actually run through our APIs.
Okay.
So they can call our API in real time, server to server. So we're not on the page. We're not doing JavaScript. A lot of times it loads faster than the other content because, we've really optimized for speed.
Yep.
And then, we can do all the work for, maybe, this company, this band wants to pay to promote it. Or maybe they're promoting it because they want to get more tickets in that one. And maybe it needs more tickets. Or they want to target that to people who liked this or in this region and, stuff like that. So it's really kind of a decision API that's primarily used for promotions and ad serving.
Okay. And so your customers now, the development teams integrate you in, not end users or content writers.
We're no longer like drop some JavaScript on a page and you're good to go. We're now like, who's the development team that's going to be building on top of our API? Like what are their goals? How do we help them achieve those goals? And it's funny because we started out trying to go much more on the package product for a marketer or a ad ops person. But I think because our DNA was always so developer focused, like we just ended up being pulled into that, right? Which I think is probably how a lot of these more developer focused companies start, is you're like, well, I know I've had this problem, or I know how I would want it to work because I'm a developer. I can actually build it more that way.
The Azure DevOps podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
And so you have lots of software engineers working for you now. When did that start to change from just being you to, okay, now you're building up more and more of a team beyond just this new college graduate?
Yeah, so it was kind of we started, once we raised money in 2011, we started to hire in engineering. Actually, in 2012, we brought in Nate Kohari, who you know as well.
Mm-hmm,
who wrote Ninject. That's kind of his .NET claim to fame.
Right.
And he helped us actually re-architect the whole ad server. So at this point, we started to get a little bit of scale, and we, the current model of light caching and hitting the database wasn't going to work. And so he actually rewrote the whole ad server piece. And we actually, at that point, we switched the ad server over to Node.js, which also, I don't know, that was a great idea. Node is fine, but we've also had lots of good and bad experiences with Node. But we also had to realize we couldn't hit the database every time, with Node. So we developed our second kind of attempt at this, which was what we started doing was taking all the data that was in SQL Server and we dump it out to a flat file. And then this flat file would get shipped out to all the different ad servers. And then the ad servers every so many minutes would pick up that flat file, load it all into memory, and then boom, you're so much faster, right? You never have a cold hit to the database. You can just access your in-memory data and go really fast.
And those files, I mean, even large ones, what your number of megabytes for one of those files?
Yeah, because it's S3 too, right? Like I said, we shipped them to the servers, but it really just dropped it on S3, and then the machines would just check S3 and pull it.
And all of the servers just have gobs of memory these days, so it's no big deal to have just all of that all the time in memory. And oh gosh, the orders of magnitude not going to disk, not hitting the network card. It's all just right there.
But then, and that worked for a long time. That got us up to, hundreds of millions of requests a day.
Okay.
And then we started running into a couple of problems with that. And so the problem we ran, because I agree with you, like this is always my ideal world. And then one of the cool things we actually came out of it was, I haven't really touched on this, but we're generating, like our product generates revenue. So if we're down for a minute, customers are losing lots of money.
And they're going to notice it.
Oh, they notice it right away, right? The ads aren't there. Like promotions aren't there.
Right.
So we had to build these things really resiliently. And that was when we kind of came up with one of our concepts, which was like every engine is an island.
Mm-hmm.
Like our idea was like, how do we make it so that, there's that myth about, somebody drywalled in a server and it was running like years later and the people couldn't find it, right? They're like, it responds to ping, but like, where is it? We're like, that's what we want our engines to be. Like if somehow one of these virtual servers gets stuck running, like 10 years later, you can call it and it's like, my data's old, but like, here's an ad,
right?
And so that's like shipping that file did that, right? Because like if SQL Server went down, it didn't matter. Like the engines had a file.
Right.
Maybe they run on that file a little bit longer than they need to, but it's okay. And there's no reliance on each other. So, if one of them gets killed or has problems, like the other ones are fine.
Right.
The challenge we ran into with that approach was not from the scale of requests. It started to be from the scale of items in the database. So, we had to create this file. And when you think about like the problem is once we started to have millions of items, like generating that file started to take too long.
Okay.
Because you're actually like, I need to generate this million line, or actually, each one was a chunk of data about an ad. And so you're like, I need to generate this thing. I can't really parallelize that because I need to generate it all as one file.
Was it XML or JSON?
I think it probably started as XML. I think it's JSON. It became JSON at some point.
But either way, that's not a streamable format because it's a document node.
Yeah. And also, and it's not really streamable either because if we started streaming it, then, if we're streaming it to S3 and then the engines are trying to pick it up, like it gets very complicated. Like, how do we try to do that? And the challenge there is that if a customer sets an ad live, like they say, okay, we're going to set this Megadeth promotion live, like they want to see it live right away. Right. But if it started to take like 15 minutes, sometimes like the loop of like generating the file and then writing it out and then getting the engines to update it.
And then they realize, oh shoot, we typoed something.
Did it wrong. Yeah, exactly. And that's the scary scenario, right? Like they put it up and they accidentally target it to Taylor Swift fans. And then they're like, oh, I want to change it. And we're like, well, it'll take 10 to 15 minutes for this to change. And
but what about all these 6-year-olds that are registered for Megadeth?
Yeah. Interesting Megadeth concert. And they're just pulling their hair out, trying to figure out how to change it. So that's when we went to kind of version 3 of the kind of caching acceleration. Which is what we did was we used Redis instead of the file. So we actually put Redis on every engine. So there's a copy of Redis on every engine. There was a master Redis.
When you say engine, we're still talking about EC2 server.
Yeah, EC2 servers. Yeah, okay. Yeah. We just always call them engines. Like these are like ad serving engines. Yeah. But yeah, these are just and now at this point we're running hundreds of them, and they're like big C4 machines, not the little M3 mediums. So we have Redis across all of those, and then Redis is really good at replication. And so what we would do is there's a control system that would be looking for changes that came in. So instead of always trying to generate this whole file, whenever a customer changed an ad, we'd register that as a change. We'd make that change to Redis, and then Redis would propagate it to all the engines. And on the engines, they could call that Redis and then do an in-memory cache. Calling local Redis is super fast, but cache is still a little bit faster because you're not parsing JSON and things like that.
Right.
So that system's gotten us pretty far. Like that's currently what we're running today. And we've got that running. We talked about like reliability. Like we have engines in US East, US West, EU, Singapore, South Korea, and Redis is actually handling replication across all of those. It's a pretty big, sophisticated Redis cluster.
Right. I think it's so amazing that even over so long a period of time with so many programming paradigm changes and frameworks and languages, the main problem that we're all still working on is how to manage data and move data from one place to the other. And when you need, say, referential integrity, okay, you need the relational database, but when you need speed, referential integrity is your enemy, but it's still it's all data problem. And 10, 20 years from now, when it's different frameworks, different everything, we're still going to be talking about things like this.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's only getting worse, right? Like I remember thinking about, 10 years ago, we're building these systems and you're like, oh, it needs to be able to handle, 100,000 rows or something like that. But now it's like everything is generating so much data, right? Like you have devices out there that generate 100,000 points of data for one user in like a week,
Right.
or whatever. And like we generate like all this data from all these requests and impressions and like, how do you process all that? Yeah.
How quickly are we going to delete the data because you have too much? Or, okay, we like, for instance, SQL Server. You got to get data out of SQL Server or else you have, multi-terabyte tables that stop being usable.
Yep. Yeah, we made a lot of interesting mistakes with SQL Server. That was one of them. Like at first, whenever we served an impression, we're like, oh, we'll just put a record in SQL Server.
Right.
Doesn't scale, right? Like as soon as you start serving millions and hundreds of millions of these things, you're like, why am I doing this? This is not what SQL Server is for, right? SQL Server is for relational data. And so we switched to using Hadoop and stuff like that to process all these raw logs. And then also I remember one of the early really bad decisions was we were like, well, just the creative, the image, like why put it on S3 or something like that? Like why put it in a file system? It's so hard to keep track of. Like just throw it in an object in SQL Server. And then one day we're like, why is this table like, 400 gigs? And because it's a lot of add objects. And so we had to go through and take it and put them all on S3 and change it all to references and clean up the database. And so it's really, when you start really scaling stuff, it's just surprising how many things break that I think was almost like a best practice for me before. Like, and then you start thinking about really big scale. It's like all that stuff changes, I think, in a lot of ways.
Now the listeners are probably have some key questions at this point. And first is why AWS and not Azure?
So we built. So this is a good question. So one, obviously I moved on to AWS in 2010.
Yeah.
So there was no Azure then. And I've used a lot. We still use SQL Server. We still use Microsoft technology. So there's nothing religious there. And my goal I was like, I never want to be locked into AWS. I was like, we're only going to use instances. We're only going to use, stuff that we can, back then it was, you just had a build script and now it's Docker or Kubernetes or whatever it is where you're like, we just use instances. But when it comes down to it, you end up relying on it. This is how they lock you in, right? Like, and it's little steps, it's little things where we're like, well, we really need a way to store, some user specific data. Right. Like we want to say like, oh, like Jeffrey likes Metallica. So we just want to store that. We store it all anonymously. We're not Facebook. We don't use this data in any bad way. But Dynamo is really good at that. Dynamo is a really good key value store, right? So we start using Dynamo. And then when we're looking at doing Hadoop and stuff, we're like, well, we can do all this ourselves, but EMR does a great job of doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're like, and when we get the data out, like instead of putting it back in SQL Server, we can put it in Redshift because Redshift can just handle, these terabytes and terabytes of data really easily. And then down the road, you start to think, oh, well, now there's actually like good offerings like Azure and I'm not a fan of Google Cloud, but it's an offering.
Right.
And so, then you look at it and you're like, oh, like we're not just using EC2, right? Like we're heavily reliant on not just EC2 and S3 and the things that everybody has, but you start to be reliant on all these things that aren't everywhere else. And if they are, even when there's, comparable things other places, like the switching cost becomes really real where it's not, it's not just like, oh, I'll run my Docker and launch it over here. You're like, well, now all my stuff is hard coded to Dynamo APIs and Redshift APIs. And so despite, I think early on the cloud being a pitch of, oh, you'll be cloud mobile and stuff like this, like we quickly got pretty locked into AWS. Hopefully my account manager at AWS doesn't hear it so I can still get good deals and things like that. But, it'd just be so hard for us to move at this point. We have been investigating running our engines in other regions, especially because we've been trying to run regions because we're API and server to server. We usually try to co-locate with our customer. So like if they're in US East, we'll give them our endpoint for US East. If they're in US West, but obviously we start to get customers who are on Azure or on Google Cloud, and so we're like, how do we go and just at least run the engines on Azure or Google Cloud, things like that. So we're digging into that, and that's a lot easier because that's just one little piece of the infrastructure. Like we just have to figure out how to replace Dynamo and replace a couple small things. We don't have to go figure out how to replace the whole thing, which has gotten relies on SQS, relies on wait, there's way too many features on my Amazon bill at the end of the month.
Yes. So at the beginning, it was you FTPing files up to an IaaS VM and then SQL database, and now you have a whole team, 3 billion requests per day. At what point, and what did it look like when you decided, you know what, this manual process isn't working? We need an automated way to get changes out to the various servers in production and have a good process where you can do that quickly.
Yeah, really, it was when I started to bring in developers who really knew what they were doing and had the time to do it. Because like one of the challenges I had was I was kind of the lead developer, but also the CEO of this new company. So I'm trying to figure out, how do we hire other people? How are we making sales? How are we doing marketing? All the things that like a CEO needs to do. And so all my developer stuff just became, yes, I knew I needed a build process and I needed a good deployment process, but that would fall behind trying to get this new contract to get us more money. So it was really when I brought in people like Nate and other like good senior professional developers that they brought that discipline in, right? The discipline around deployments and build systems and things like that.
Okay. And do you have set times where you deploy, or does it happen just whenever it needs to?
Yeah, so we've always kind of taken the approach, basically whenever it needs to, not Friday night or not Friday, right? And our reason for that isn't as much that like a lot of times I think people pick on that, like don't deploy on Fridays things because they're well that's it means you don't have confidence in your systems or whatever. For us, it actually has a lot to do with when our customers use the system. So, we have their Monday to Friday customers, right? Like there are people who are setting up ads and looking at data and they're working in our system all day long. Doing things on Friday or Friday afternoon makes the least sense because if we do break something, it's a very complicated system, right? If we do break something, we're not going to break something that we have a test for, right? We're not going to take the system down. If we break something, it's going to be something non-obvious and it can do real revenue damage. And so, if you deploy on a Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, the chances of somebody finding that and catching it as they're using the system early and quickly are really high. And then we can roll back, we can, hot fix it, get it fixed. But if you do it on Friday, there's a much lower chance that like Monday morning you come in to some emails of revenue was down 20% over the weekend. What happened? So that's why we don't deploy on Fridays.
Okay. Well, another question that a lot of managers have, or lead developers that are kind of pseudo managers, they're often asked by their superiors, hey, why the long lead time? Or why is something taking so long? Or why do we have a quality problem? And here you are, you're managing a team. And I'm sure there's been times when something bad happened or you wish something was already done and it's not done yet. And so what advice would you give for what questions to ask to get the information you need besides just I'm working hard, boss?
Yeah. I mean, that's tough because it's funny how quickly you probably had the same thing, like how quickly you go from, you're the guy being asked the questions to as soon as you're on the other side of it, like you're quickly like, oh, I'm being the guy that annoyed me when I was an engineer, right? Like how's it going today? What's the status of this today? It's like same as yesterday. I've spent all day trying to get this one function to work. Leave me alone,
Right.
No, I think that it all comes down to breaking down the questions. I think is when it's how's it going? It's not a useful question, right? Because they're like, oh, it's going well, or is this still on track to deploy by the end of next month? Like nobody knows, right? Like they don't know that. There's still so many unknowns, right? So I think if you've kind of properly understood and planned out the work, you can ask like more targeted questions of, like if that, like if our goal is to get this in customers' hands by the end of the next month, that we have to deploy this change to this system by the end of this month, you ask about that system. And maybe to get that system done, they need to get tested. And so you can ask like, well, is this in testing yet? So you ask like a concrete yes or no question, like, hey, is this in testing yet? It's like, no, it's not in testing. Okay, like what's left to get it in testing? It's like, oh, well, I've got to do this. I've got to figure out this. Okay, cool. And then you kind of have their questions asked in the future, like, did we get those two things done? To try to break it down. Because I think as developers, we all just want to be like, we just want the conversation to end as quickly as possible when somebody's asking us like how it's going. Like we just want to get back to work.
I don't want to lose my thought process. Leave me alone.
Yeah. And we're just tired of like status, being asked for status. But then being on the other side, you feel for the business people where you're like, oh, like we told a customer we'd have this feature. And now I have no clue when we're going to have it because, we're 1 week late, and that's always happens, right? But then you're like, was this 1 week or is this going to be 7 weeks? And, development is just still such a tough thing to, I think, quantify. Unless you spend a ton of time doing that, right? Like I'm sure it can, like people are always like, well, it can be done. Well, sure. But like you have to spend a lot of time just sitting there and estimating and getting, to get the perfect estimate.
Right. Okay. Well, hey, this is a lot of great information, and congratulations on the success of Adzerk and just the number of and stature of the customers that you're currently serving is pretty impressive. As some of the listeners may be struggling with performance problems or wanting to scale their own systems, are there any resources or other tips that you'd like to leave them with?
I think the key thing is to, there is a lot of research out there on scaling now. I'll say that's changed a lot in the last 8 years. Like I think, back then there was a lot more of a black art of how to scale to this volume, but now you have so many companies doing it. There's lots of good articles out there from different SaaS companies and different API companies on how they've scaled. Those presentations and things like that have always been really, really valuable. And I can give you some links and stuff like that if you want to include them in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be great.
But then also I think is to kind of throw out your assumptions of before you're trying to build something to really scale. Just the, like you mentioned, things being normalized and things like that. It's like, these are the best practices, right? When you're building a certain type of system, but when you're building something to really scale, a lot of that changes. And so where it's, people are like, well, I would never think about using C++ to build my line of business app, right? But it quickly comes up that you're like, hey, we should rewrite this part of the code in C++. Like it's going to run a lot faster. And so, it really starts to, change what you're doing. So I think, leave a lot of those assumptions and things like that, challenge all your assumptions and figure out, why you're doing that and how's it going to impact performance.
Awesome. Well, hey, man, thanks for the time. Thanks for being with us on the show today. It was great.
Yeah, absolutely.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.